Probable cause. Those are the most important words of the day today. Probable cause. We have now publicly reached the state of probable cause in the special prosecutor's investigation of Donald Trump and his family and his campaign associates. Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller has found probable cause that a crime has been committed. And Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller believes that Paul Manafort cannot be trusted to hand over evidence in the special prosecutor's investigation. Those are the two things that the special prosecutor had to establish for a federal judge in order to convince that federal judge to sign a search warrant for one of Paul Manafort's homes in Alexandria, Virginia. The special prosecutor had to show the judge that there is probable cause that a crime has been committed and had to convince the judge that Paul Manafort cannot be trusted to not commit the crime of destroying or hiding evidence subpoenaed by the special prosecutor. Just issuing a standard subpoena to Paul Manafort is typically the way evidence is collected by prosecutors in so-called white-collar criminal cases like this. Raiding a home in the middle of the night is an indication of a very serious criminal case and criminal investigation. The Washington Post reported this morning that the FBI executed that raid on Wednesday, July 26th. One former federal prosecutor told the Washington Post that the raid, quote, adds a shock and awe enforcement component to what until now has followed a natural path for a white-collar investigation. The raid occurred the day after Paul Manafort met with Senate Intelligence Committee staff. We don't know when President Trump found out about the raid, but it is entirely possible that Paul Manafort's lawyers told the president's lawyers about the raid basically as soon as it happened. And President Trump's lawyers would, of course, immediately tell their client about the raid. And so, by 8:55 a.m., when the president issued some of his first tweets of the day, the president might have been trying to shift attention away from the special prosecutor's investigation that day onto an entirely new story, and that is exactly what the president's first tweets did. That is the morning that the president tweeted his announcement that the United States government will not accept or allow transgender individuals to serve in any capacity in the U.S. military. If the president was trying to change the subject, it worked. The Defense Department was caught off guard by the president's announcement and had no comment on it. And we later discovered that the president decided to fire off those tweets, even though he had been told by White House lawyers and Defense Department lawyers that there were serious legal implications involved in a policy announcement like that, and that everyone the president had consulted on this issue in the White House and the State Department was still working on it when the president surprised them all by issuing that tweet. So if you're Donald Trump, and you know about the raid of Paul Manafort's home early that morning, what do you do? And remember, when you consider that question of what do you do if you're Donald Trump, as far as we know, this president only knows how to do one thing: tweet. That's the only thing he actually knows how to do. This president's first reaction to everything is to tweet. Up to now, there were indications that the president had just grown impatient with the advice he was getting from the Defense Department lawyers and the White House lawyers about a transgender ban in the military, and so he just decided to break the logjam by tweeting. The Defense Department immediately made it clear that they do not create new policies by tweet and that nothing had changed in our military because of that tweet. And if something was going to change, there would have to be a carefully written legal directive from the president to begin even thinking about how to execute that change in the Defense Department. And so those tweets about a transgender ban that is not happening enter the suspicion zone of Trump behavior involving the Russia investigation. Of course, trying to change the subject in the news media has absolutely no effect on the investigation, which is something that this president might not completely understand. The news media can go off onto any story it wants to all day for days on end, and that has nothing to do with the Russia investigation. The Russia investigation will proceed, no matter what the news media is talking about. And we now know that it will proceed with subpoenas and with FBI raids in the middle of the night whenever necessary. Because Robert Mueller has found probable cause, and a federal judge believes Robert Mueller has found probable cause. About an hour after the president tweeted about his desire to ban transgender people from the military, a desire that has no legal effect whatsoever, he tweeted this: Why didn't AG Sessions replace acting FBI Director Andrew McCabe, a Comey friend, who was in charge of Clinton investigation but got big dollars, $700,000 for his wife's political run from Hillary Clinton and her representatives drain the swamp? Maybe the president found out about the FBI raid after he successfully changed the subject to the transgender ban. Or maybe he just couldn't contain himself from taking a shot at the leader of the FBI, the law enforcement agency that just raided his former campaign chairman's home. An hour after the Washington Post broke the story about the FBI raid of Paul Manafort's home today, the National Enquirer broke a different story about Paul Manafort. Under the headline, Donald Trump advisor Paul Manafort caught up in sick sex scandal. Now, it might be what qualifies as a sex scandal in America. It certainly isn't what qualifies as a sex scandal in France. But there seems to be nothing sick about it in anyone's definition of sick. It's a story alleging that Paul Manafort had an affair with a younger woman, which, as we all know, is a life specialty of Donald Trump's. But the National Enquirer is a Trump tool. When it comes to Trump stories, the National Enquirer is simply another version of Donald Trump's tweets. The National Enquirer does not publish anything that Donald Trump does not want the National Enquirer to publish. And so Paul Manafort has every right to read the National Enquirer today as an attack on him authorized by Donald Trump. It may be the most unwise attack Donald Trump has ever launched, because as the special prosecutor closes in on Paul Manafort will be facing the possibility of 5 years in federal prison on possible tax evasion charges for what could be tens of millions of dollars in cash that was paid for activities Paul Manafort performed involving the country of Ukraine, where a ledger was found indicating that Paul Manafort was paid $17 million in cash by the then pro-Putin political party in Ukraine. Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller may have probable cause of some other crimes committed by Paul Manafort, all of which can turn out to be reasons Paul Manafort might want to cooperate with the special prosecutor and provide testimony of crimes committed by others in order to save himself from prison, including the possibility of Paul Manafort testifying against people named Trump or the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Paul Manafort is not the only one who should have been terrified to discover that Robert Mueller now has probable cause.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.